Well, good afternoon, Australia. My name is Narelda Jacobs, and it is my great pleasure to be your MC and moderator this afternoon. We're here for a very special occasion. It is the launch of the Bankwest Curtin Economic Centre and Workplace Gender Equality Agency's Gender Equity Insights 2022, the State of Inequality in Australia report. I am a Whadjuk Noongar woman hailing from Boorloo, Perth. I am now living on Gadigal country of the Eora Nation, and I would like to pay my respects to elders on the nation of which I am meeting, and I'd ask for you to also do the same. But I'd also like to now introduce to you Emeritus Professor Simon Forrest, Whadjuk Noongar Elder and Curtin University Fellow, who will welcome us to country.
Kaya. Kaya Wanju. Hello and welcome. My name is Simon Forrest Burungu. I'm a Whadjuk Baladong Noongar with kin connections to Yamaji and Wongai peoples. I am of this land and place. I follow a bloodline of people who have walked and cared for this land for over 40,000 years. This is a welcome to country, a welcome to Whadjuk Noongar Buja. A welcome to country recognises and acknowledges us and the first and continuing custodians of this land, Australia. Nidja Bolo, Nidja Gungungap, Nidja Margarap, Nidja Mindarap. Kaya Wanju, Nan Kwel, Simon Forrest Burungu. Kaya Wanju, Nidja Whadjuk Noongar Buja, Nal Karich Noongar Mod, Ken Karat Nidja Buja. Nan Karich, Noongar Kabali, Borankoriye.
Big love and respect to Professor Forrest for welcoming us onto Whadjuk Noongar Buja there. And once again, wherever you are on this wonderful country of ours, I'd ask you to please pay your respects to the traditional owners on the lands on which we are meeting today. Now, once again, thank you for joining us for this very special occasion. BCEC and WGEA Gender Equity Insights 2022 National Report. Today is the day we are launching. This is the 7th year BCEC and WGEA have partnered to find the evidence leading to tangible action that businesses and government can take to improve gender inequality in Australia. And for the first time, this year's report compares pay outcomes across states and territories and regions, throwing new light on gender segregation. We are about to get stuck into a really great discussion with industry experts, and we're going to throw it open to you. We're going to ask you to give us some questions. You can do so. I'll give you some more instructions about this when we come to the time, but if you see the question box on your screen, then that's where you go to ask a question of our expert panel, which we will get to in a moment. We want you to engage on social media and tell the whole country how amazing this session is, and any observations that you make or anything that you learn or things that you'd like to share. If you are tweeting or posting along today, please use the hashtag gender equality and tag BCEC via @BankwestCurtin and WGEA via @WGE Agency. All right, well, with all that said, let's begin with some welcoming remarks. And I'm going to ask you to put your hands together at home or in the office for Rebecca Mitchell, Chief Information Officer at Bankwest, to open proceedings. Rebecca.
Thank you, Narelda. It's my pleasure to welcome you all today to this Bankwest Curtin Economic Centre and Workplace Gender Equality Agency Gender Equity Insights report launch for 2022 in what is now the 7th report in the series. Over the past 7 years, the Gender Equity Insights report has grown in prestige as a leading source of gender diversity analysis and discussion in Australia. Every year I find this report incredibly insightful and inspirational, and I am sure this year will be no different, and I am really looking forward to your questions and the discussion later in the event. Celebrating its 10th birthday later this month, our partnership with Curtin University to support the Bankwest Curtin Economic Centre forms part of our ongoing communities and economies in which we operate. The social and economic research produced by the Centre continues to help inform, shape, debate and public policy on critical issues impacting our nation. You may not be aware that Bankwest is one of WA's largest employers of technology professionals, and these technology professionals play a critical role in how we adapt to changing customer needs, as more and more of our customers expect simple, quick and digitally driven experiences with us. One thing is for certain, and that's that technology is a frontier of continual change, growth and opportunities. However, it will come as no surprise that the technology industry has been a typically male-dominated industry. I'm pleased to say that 38% of Bankwest's current technology workforce and leadership team are female, in what feels like a positive shift for gender equality in our industry. We know that there's so much more we can do to encourage and support gender diversity, whether it's through our strategic partnerships with high schools, industry events which provide females with an opportunity to learn to code, and our graduate program, to providing mentoring opportunities for our female colleagues. But I feel that the other missing piece of the puzzle here is about giving men the flexibility to take on more caring responsibilities, so women can remain in or re-enter the workforce, and for workplaces to not only offer this, but empower men to do so. I am personally grateful to have an employer that even at my level supports flexible working. 2 days a week, I start and finish work early, enabling me to pick up my kids from school and take them to their various sports and appointments. It works as I can be online in the morning with the East Coast and then in the afternoon get to connect with my family. I encourage the men in my team to take up flexible working options so that they can play an active role in their family and as leaders be role models to our organisation. Because for me, ultimately diversity as a whole is really important. It's important the diversity of our 3,000 strong workforce reflects that of the 1.1 million customers that we serve nationally. Because this diversity allows us to understand how we can better support the changing needs of our customers and communities. So thank you to Professor Alan Duncan and Dr. Silvia Salazar for this report, and to the expert panelists for joining us today. I very much look forward to hearing from you all shortly and the discussion that follows. Thank you, and back to Narelda.
Rebecca, thank you for setting such a wonderful tone for the afternoon that we are about to have. Well, Rebecca, you mentioned Professor Alan Duncan, the Director of the Bankwest Curtin Economic Centre, and the report co-author, Dr. Silvia Salazar, Research Fellow at the Centre. So let's bring Alan and Dr. Silvia in now to talk about the research findings. Professor Duncan and Dr. Salazar, it is over to you.
Thanks, Narelda, and thank you all for joining us for today's launch. We really appreciate your interest in the hugely topical issue, how we make gender equity a priority for Australia. So as Narelda says, Silvia and I are going to share the presentation of the main findings from this report, but before we do, we'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that we're meeting on and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. We're speaking to you from the lands of the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation. And we'd also like to thank Mary Wooldridge and her team at the Workplace Gender Equality Agency for the privilege of this partnership. So achieving gender equality in Australia remains a topic of continued focus for governments, businesses peak organisations across the country, but consensus on how far Australia needs to go to achieve gender equality is still a contested space, and too often dominated by debates around the extent of what are commonly termed like-for-like pay gaps. But of course, bearing down on direct pay discrimination is essential, but evidence that women and men receive the same pay for the same roles is regarded by some as sufficient to assert that gender equality has been reached. But gender equality is about so much more than equal pay. It's about equality of access to economic opportunity and the industries that women and men concentrate in or from which they're excluded. It speaks to women's access to more senior or high salaried jobs and to the value of women's roles in the labour market and how that value is recognised through remuneration. This most recent report is the first time since the series began that we've been able to explore gender pay outcomes across state jurisdictions and regional areas, and we've also been able to uncover some detailed insights into how average salaries for women and men vary over the course of their working lives. And as always, we translate these insights into an agenda for action and look at the particular roles that businesses can play. So our analysis compares average pay differences between women and men across state jurisdictions, taking advantage of voluntary reporting information on employees' places of work available for the first time in the latest WGEA data collection. Silvia.
And we find that location does matter. Western Australia is by some margin the state that supports the largest difference in average pay between women and men. The gender pay gap in Western Australia is calculated at 32% in total remuneration, which includes bonuses, overtime, and other discretionary pay. New South Wales, Queensland, and the Northern Territory all show gender pay gaps between 23 to 25%, with Victoria slightly lower at 22%. Tasmania has the lowest pay gap across all states and territories at 10.4%. The gender pay gap in total remuneration is almost always higher than for base salary. This suggests that women are generally less able to access discretionary pay than men, and this serves to amplify pay gaps. And what is behind these states and territory differences? States and territories vary in their industry composition, but also in the share of women working across industry sectors and the salary that each sector pays. The same is true for occupations. This table illustrates this point vividly. The mining, construction, and manufacturing sectors engage the lowest share of women, typically under 30% of their workforces. On the other hand, women make up 80% of the workers in healthcare and social assistance, and 2/3 of workers in the education and training sector. And yet, miners are paid on average twice the salaries of those who work in healthcare and social assistance. The point here is that gender concentrations does not itself create gender pay gaps. Rather, it is the interplay between gender concentration on the one hand and pay difference between female and male-dominated industry or roles on the other. That is what drives the gender pay gaps nationally and across the state jurisdictions. The difference in average total remuneration between men and women in Australia comes in at just under $26,000. And breaking this down by industry, we find that healthcare and social assistance adds $5,000 to the national gender pay gap. That's about 19% of the total pay gap. More than half of this contribution, around $2,800, comes from the high concentration of women in the health sector and the lower salaries compared to some other industries. Professional, scientific, and technical services adds $4,000 to the national pay gap, mostly because of salary difference between men and women. And the mining sector adds $3,400 or 13% to the national pay gap, mainly because more men than women are employed in mining. For occupations, community and personal services account for more than 1/5 of the national gender pay gap, almost all because of the high concentration of women in the workforce. Professional occupations are responsible for 1/4 of the total gender pay gap, but this is mainly due to the salary difference between women and men. It may seem unusual that the laborers category reduces the national pay gap, but since salaries for laborers are relatively low, the higher share of men, around 65% of all laborers, would mean that increasing the share of women would actually increase the gender pay gap inequality. Postcode data in the most recent WGEA collection allow us to look at the region of Australia with the largest gender pay gaps. The Delhi region surrounding Darwin have the largest pay gap in the country at 52.5%. 9 of the top 10 localities for gender pay gap are in regional areas of the country. 7 have mining as the top employing industry, and 7 have healthcare and social assistance among the top 2 employing industries. And women face a remoteness penalty in the salaries they can access when working in regional areas of the country. The base pay gap is around 19% in major cities of Australia. However, the pay gap rises steadily to 28% for those working in remote areas and 29% for workers in very remote parts of the country. Gender concentration by industry and occupation are responsible for much of these differences. And gender pay gap remain even after taking account of compositional effects. If we compare women and men with a matched sample, with a sample with similar characteristics, we still find that the gender pay gap rises with the degree of remoteness. Alan.
So for this latest report, we also take advantage of another important innovation in the WGEA data collection. WGEA's reporting data now includes the year of birth of employees for most organisations in the collection. And this means that we can now look at the relative pay trajectories of women and men by age. And this throws up some fascinating insights into the ages at which gender pay gaps start to diverge for different industries and occupations. The first observation is that profiles of earnings by age differ substantially between managers and non-managers. The gender pay gap for managers, the grey shaded area on the left chart here, sits at around 10% before the age of 30, but rises consistently to a pay gap of 25% by the age of 50 and to 30% at retirement age. The pay gap for non-managers also rises with age to just over 20% by the age of 50, but it moderates at later ages. And as we mentioned, one reason for the greater gender pay gap for managers is that women don't have the same access to discretionary pay as men. And this raises questions for businesses about how bonuses, overtime and discretionary payments are allocated by gender within their organisations, something that we noted in the 2016 report in this series. Age earnings profiles also vary by industry, but what's especially interesting are the differences in the ages at which earnings for women and men diverge depending upon the industry sector. Pay trajectories in construction diverge pretty much from age 20 to a pay gap of 35% for workers beyond age 45, and this is most likely due to occupational segregation in the industry. The gender pay gap in education and training favours women up to the age of 30, but crosses to benefit men at later ages. This may be showing the effects of mid-career breaks for family reasons, leading to ongoing impacts on women's future salaries compared to those of men. And the age of divergence in mining and manufacturing happens far later. Average salaries remain relatively close between women and men up to the age of 45, but diverge at later ages. Now, this is likely the result of cohort effects, with improved gender equity in pay and progression for younger workers in those sectors. So these findings open up some important conversations about how work is valued for women and men across industry sectors, and particularly female-dominated sectors. As we've mentioned, cohort effects, family effects, occupational segregation, either individually or in combination, all have some role to play. So too will direct discrimination. But there are some more fundamental questions to be addressed about how women's contributions in the workforce and women's work are valued. The care services sector provides an instructive and topical case study. Women make up 80% of the healthcare and social assistance workforce and 71% of the sector's full-time workers. But the shares of women working in different parts of the sector vary substantially, as do their relative pay trajectories by age. Gender pay gaps diverge from around age 25 in some parts of the sector, usually those with a high share of men. In medical, pathology and imaging services, for example, gender pay gaps rise to beyond 40% by the age of 50. But for people working in childcare services, 93% of whom are women, the gender pay gap favours women up to the age of 25, but then shifts towards men at later ages. And women's earnings in childcare totally flatlines until retirement. Residential services is another sector where women's pay trajectories are flat beyond the age of 30. And this chart gives you a broader perspective on the role that salary plays in driving gender pay gaps. It's a bubble chart that shows average salaries on the horizontal against the share of women working in care sector industries on the vertical, with the size of the bubble reflecting the size of the gender pay gap. And what jumps out immediately is that the greater the share of women, the lower the average salary, and the greater the share of men, the larger the gender pay gap. We need to ensure that childcare, aged care and allied health roles that have traditionally been undertaken by women are remunerated in a way that better reflects their value to society, and not just the contemporaneous or immediate benefit, but the ongoing value that health and care sector occupations give to society over the medium and the longer term. Silvia.
Thanks, Alan. To make headway in reducing Australia's gender pay gap, we need to understand those factors that prevent or discourage women and men from working in specific industry sectors, and what can businesses do to drive change. The normalization of flexible work arrangements for both men and women is an effective strategy in breaking down gender and barriers to employment. This is something that Alan and Rebecca Castle show in the 2019 Gender Equity Insights report. The share of companies offering flexible work options have certainly risen over the last 4 years. However, most of the changes are concentrated in certain domains of work flexibility. The share of businesses that promote flexible work throughout their organization has risen fourfold since 2017, with COVID-19 no doubt the key driver of this change. Leaders are visible role models of flexible working for nearly 70% of businesses. But only 1 in 10 organizations sets targets for flexible work, and only 5% extend those targets specifically for men. Policies that support family and care responsibilities are better for employees, but better for businesses also. The provision of high-quality paid parental leave is case in point. But other than paid parental leave, the measures available to workers with family or caring responsibilities are relatively limited, both in scope and in size. Most businesses now offer breastfeeding facilities, and 30% offer coaching on returning to work from parental leave. But other forms of supports are still relatively rare. 7% of organizations offer on-site childcare. Less than 6% offer school holidays care support, and only 5% offer subsidized childcare. Almost all organizations now offer unpaid domestic violence leave to employees, but currently only a third offer access to paid parental leave, leave. A number of other FDV support measures have become close to ubiquitous among businesses that report to WGEA. This includes confidentiality of disclosure, dedicated flexible working arrangements, employee assistance programs, and protection from adverse action. Alan.
So we've shown how gender concentrations and salary differences add to gender pay gaps across Australia, and this speaks to the roles that businesses can play in broadening women's access to economic security through employment across all industry sectors. But what's the size of the prize on offer? How much would Australia's gender pay gap be reduced with a more gender balanced workforce? And here we're talking about gender balance in both directions, increasing the share of women working in male-dominated occupations in industries and growing the share of men in female-dominated roles. The Industry Superfund HESTA established the 40-40 vision, which was an initiative that seeks to achieve an executive leadership workforce comprising at least 40% women and 40% men. And for this report, we simulate a world in which the 40-40 vision is extended to all industry sectors and all occupations by modifying the gender composition of roles in WGEA's employee data. So the modelling works by reassigning roles in the WGEA data to a point where we achieve 40-40-20 gender concentrations. Women are moved across industry and occupation boundaries into roles currently occupied by men. The same process is undertaken for men. So what would this new world look like?
Well, it would look a lot better. Australia's gender pay gap would fall by more than a third to 15.6% if all industries and occupations achieve a balance of at least 40% women and 40% men. And gender pay gap would fall substantially in every state and territory. For Western Australia, the gender pay gap in total remuneration will halve from 32.1% to 16.5% if gender balance reach 40-40-20. And for the Northern Territory, the gender pay gap will drop by 17.3 percentage points to only 8.3%. This table gives a vivid demonstration of the influence that gender concentration has on pay inequity in Australia.
Silvia has shown very clearly the size of the prize when it comes to improving gender equality in Australia. So what can businesses and governments do to drive change? Businesses have an important role to play in shifting the dial. Gender diversity and the elimination of unconscious bias should be continued as a focus in recruitment and promotion processes. So too should be the removal of gendered barriers to progression in leadership. Businesses should continue to promote flexible work options and expand the provision of policies that support family and care responsibilities. And the same is true for policies that address workplace harassment and improve respect at work. And benefits flow not just to workers, but to employers as well, because early research in this Gender Equity Insights series shows that gender diversity in leadership is demonstrably better for business. And government should use all policy levers at their disposal to support the creation of a positive, respectful and fair workplace environment. This should include the regulation of workplace standards relating to health, safety and respect, mandated paid FTV leave and the introduction of transparent reporting and potentially publishing information on gender pay gaps. Subsidies that mitigate the high cost of childcare are certainly effective in reducing barriers to employment amongst families with children. But the childcare quality and flexibility is another important part of the story, especially since the flexibility of the childcare services product may not be evolving to meet the changing needs of an increasingly flexible workforce. But achieving a greater gender balance in traditionally male-dominated or female-dominated industries and occupations will take us only so far in narrowing gender pay gaps across Australia. And that's, as we mentioned before, because gender concentration itself does not create gender pay gaps. Rather, it's the interplay between gender concentration and pay differences in female-dominated and male-dominated sectors that drives the pay gap in average salaries between women and men. And this is where a national conversation on gender equality needs to embrace more fundamental ideas about how occupations are valued and paid. We need to ensure that roles more commonly undertaken by women in education, healthcare and social assistance, childcare and aged care services are remunerated in a way that better reflects their value to society. And then this feeds into a much broader agenda for action to reflect on cultures that limit the abilities or moderate the aspirations of people from all genders and ages to target any career they choose. Thank you.
Alan and Silvia, thank you so much for that incredible research. You've identified and pinpointed all of the problems or the biggest issues that we face and what needs to happen, the solutions, if you will. Well, our next speaker is all about the solutions. Let's hear from Australia's leader in workplace equality and equity, the person tasked with ensuring women and men and gender diverse are represented, valued and rewarded in our workplaces. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Mary Wooldridge, Director of WGEA. Having joined WGEA in May 2029 after a distinguished career in the public, private and not-for-profit sectors, which saw her become Victoria's Minister for Mental Health, Community Services and Women's Affairs. Please make very welcome Mary Wooldridge.
Thanks very much, Nerelda, and it's wonderful to be here at this launch today. And I also want to join with Simon and acknowledge the traditional owners and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Of course, we're coming from lands all around the country. I'm coming from Wurundjeri land, and it's a pleasure to be with everyone today. I also want to take the opportunity to acknowledge Alan and the team. You've just seen from the presentation what a phenomenal amount of work and analysis and thought and insight has been put into this latest in the BCEC WGEA Gender Equity Insights series. And this is a wonderful partnership that we value so highly. It is the 7th report and 7 years that the partnership's been in place. And Alan, you and your team have done an exceptional job. Each and every time it is groundbreaking work, you know, being a catalyst for new conversations, new insights, new understanding. And so thank you for the work that you do and the leadership that you show so that we can really have a much better understanding of gender equality and the solutions to drive change. As Alan said, this is the first time we have collected both location and age data, and we put it in as a voluntary question. We're hoping with the review of the Act and the legislative changes that are coming through, it will be a mandatory question in the not too distant future. But I really want to give credit to the employers. Over 70% of employers stepped up and provided this information on a voluntary basis that enabled this analysis and this insight to be able to take place. And we do recognise the work that it takes to report to WGEA. So we have this amazing data set to do the analysis, and there'll be many employers on the call. And so thank you for the efforts that you've done. I was going to draw some insights, but Alan and Silvia have covered that quite comprehensively, and we do want to get onto the discussion. But I think it's fascinating that of the many insights, and there's lots to talk about, this focus on gender segregation is such an important one in terms of what's coming out of the analysis today. And the opportunities we have, not just to look at segregated industries, but also to look at the interplay of salaries and how those highly feminized roles are valued within society. The information today is a catalyst for all of those discussions. And of course, underneath all of this, we need to look at the gender stereotypes that we have in Australia and how that influences our children from a very early age in terms of their activities, their involvement, their interests, their subjects, their courses and their career aspirations. Because in many cases, it's many of those stereotypes that are reinforcing the segregation that we then see in workplaces. So it does give us a platform for very broad, fundamental, generational changing discussions and ones that we need to have. And I believe there's an appetite to have as part of the development of a broader national gender equality strategy. So looking forward to the discussion very much. Today's report is a catalyst. It's a catalyst for the discussion, for the understanding, for the action, and for the change that we all aspire to see. And thank you for being part of the discussion today and helping to make it a reality and the changes we want to see into the future. Thanks for that, and back to you, Nerelda.
Mary, thank you so much. And on behalf of everyone, thank you for your contribution to gender equality and equity in this country. Exactly like you said, gender equality isn't just a workplace issue, it's a societal issue, it's a community issue, it's a family issue. And I'm looking forward to the contribution that you're going to make, Mary, on the panel, which you're joining us for. Alan Duncan is also joining us in the panel discussion that we're going to be kicking off right now. Before I introduce our next two panellists, I'm just going to run through how the question is going to work, the Q&A session. We've got some questions that are already flooding in, which is fantastic. All you need to do is just look for the question box on your screen, and that will take you to where you can pose the question. Try and make it, as simple as possible, so I can read it quickly. And if you'd like to address it to a particular person on the panel, please also just put their name as well, and we'll try and get through as many questions as we can. We've got plenty of time for questions, so we're going to try and get through as many as we can. Well, joining Mary and Alan on the panel, we have the CEO of Australia's only national independent think tank on regional issues. It's a big welcome to Regional Australia Institute CEO Liz Ritchie. Liz, lovely to have you with us. We also have the Director of State Super, Carol Austin, has a wealth of experience in the finance industry, holding executive roles at the Reserve Bank of Australia, at BHP. She's also on a raft of boards, way too long to mention in her bio. So it's a big welcome as well to Carol Austin. Carol, lovely to have you with us this afternoon. Thank you to all of our panellists for joining us. Liz, I'm going to start with you. There's a huge... Talking about regional Australia, there is a huge shortage of workers. There's a huge skilled shortage as well, which regional Australia is feeling that very acutely. You see it as a bit of an opportunity, the shortage that we're experiencing. How is this an opportunity?
Thanks, Norelda. And just before I answer that great question, I would also just like to acknowledge as traditional owners from where I am beaming from today, the Ngunnawal country here in Canberra. And also to congratulate Alan and the team at Bankwest Curtin Economics. It's great to see this report coming through. And WGEA, I just cannot tell you how excited I was to see the postcode data and really digging in to actually look at how gender equity is being felt right across the country, and putting that regional lens on what is such a critical issue. So look, to answer your question about where I see opportunity, as you've rightly pointed out, Norelda, we are experiencing record job vacancies right across the country, but in particular in regional Australia right now. In fact, we've just had the latest numbers released, and once again, another record's been broken this week with 93,000 job vacancies across the country. And this is something that the Institute tracks monthly, and we have done really for the last 3 years. And I think what's been interesting throughout COVID has been to watch this rise in opportunities that are available in regional Australia. We've had more than 100% increase in job vacancies being felt. And probably what's most telling is that those opportunities are being seen in what I'd describe as the professional sphere. So turning to where the opportunity lies, we can see that there's so much incredible data represented in today's presentation, where the divergence in age starts to occur across sectors. You can see that starts to happen at that sort of 30 age bracket and onwards. And so what I can see as an opportunity across regional Australia is ensuring that more senior managerial roles and executive roles are available to women and men, but really considering those opportunities for women in regional Australia, and ensuring that there's that flexibility. So we've talked a lot about flexibility. We've seen the changes from 2017 to 2021, which is a really positive change, but we continue to see that those senior roles, so senior executive roles, continue to stay in our metro cities. the more executive roles that we can see being undertaken in a flexible and remote fashion across regional Australia will go a long way to ensuring that we can close what is clearly a regional penalty when it comes to gender equality.
Liz, is it more of a case of a rethink, or is it reform? Is it changing up the way we think about things?
Yeah, look, I would say it's absolutely both. I mean, you know, we've just launched a report called Rebalance the Nation, and this is all about how do you rethink what the country looks like coming out of COVID? How do we ensure that more opportunities in higher paid occupations are able to be available right across the country? So there's definitely a reform required, but what we're asking is, you know, there's such a diverse range of industry and corporates beaming into today's event. And I'd really, you know, we started tracking the data where there is gender pay gaps, but let's start tracking the data about where are these roles being undertaken and what opportunity can you provide to your, you know, all of your employees to provide choice. COVID has changed many, many things about how we live and work. And we know that 1 in 5 metro city dwellers want to live in regional Australia. But if they don't have those career opportunities and they can see that not only are they going to continue to feel what is a national pay gap, they're going to be penalised by a further 10%, up to 10%, should they make that move to regions. That's simply not good enough.
Liz, thank you very much for that. Carol, I'm going to come to you now, because a lot of those jobs and career progression that exists is in the resource sector, and that's where you've had a lot of experience. How do we smash the gender norms? You know, those stereotypical, you know, traditional male jobs, traditional female jobs. How do we smash those? And you know, are the gatekeepers ready to do their job in being as open as what Liz is saying?
Thank you for that. I'd again like to acknowledge the traditional owners. I come from the Camaragal area. The sector differences are huge. I spent some time working at BHP, and at that time I was the most senior woman in the organisation. There was very few senior women in not just head office, but certainly in the more remote locations. BHP has done an enormous amount since then to try and change the situation. It's changed the jobs, which has meant that they are more family friendly, which means they're more attractive to a broader range of men as well as women. But there are some jobs, realistically, somebody that's working in the healthcare sector is not going to be motivated to work in a mine shaft in remote Western Australia. And we shouldn't seek to achieve that. I think the report that Alan and Silvia have done is fantastic. But if we stand back at it and look at the sum total of the results that come out, we should be, as a nation, ashamed of the slow progress we've made. We introduced equal pay legislation 50 years ago. It is illegal not to pay people the same amount for doing the same job. Why is it 50 years on, we've still got such large differences? And I think the nation has been very laid back in its attitude to these issues. And importantly, I think they've allowed the caring profession to underpay people for a very long time. And what we saw in COVID is, I think there was a wake-up call that we all realised how much we valued the teachers for not just the in front of children support that they provided, but the preparation behind the mental health support that they provided for children. And we certainly enhanced our understanding of the complexity of their roles and the importance of their roles. Similarly with childcare and absolutely with healthcare. And if we're not careful, we're going to lose that appreciation and go back to saying, well, it would cost us a lot of money to rebalance the pay scales. There needs to be constant dialogue of saying, these people's pay scales have been allowed to drift lower relative to other professions, and it's time to take stock of it and think about how over the longer term we reprice those. It's not as though they're in a market mechanism. There are government subsidies and very important interventions by governments that mean that there isn't a true market price for much of the services, the caring profession services. And so as a nation, I think there needs to be much more dialogue about how we value the contributions of those in the caring professions and how much more we would be prepared to pay for their services, because that's the reality of what we're talking about. If we want to pay the caring professions, who are large in number, more salaries and wages, somebody has to pay for it. And it's either in taxes or a restructuring of how we think about their roles. And on that second point, many of the caring professions have not pushed for pay increases because they've had a large number of part-time workers who tend not to be as active on an industrial relations front as full-time workers. They've had a lot of migrant workers who tend either to be short-term in the workforce and return home. So you haven't had people that see the caring professions as a long-term commitment on their part, where they expect to move up through the ranks of that profession and are committed to making the profession more highly valued and increasing its status amongst other professions. And so one of the things, coming back to Liz's point about the shortage of staff and certainly the shortage of migrant workers, perhaps we're going to find that we're going to have to offer them better pay and career progression to attract people into the professions where they'll see it is in their long-term interest to engage in this profession, and they can see that there are stages of advancement that makes it attractive for them to come into it. So it's a huge opportunity, the shortage of labour that we're experiencing at the moment, but also that learning from COVID, that these professions enhanced our quality of life in a really material way.
Carol, thank you very much for that. Mary, I'm going to bring you in now. A huge part of the report is about gender concentration. And as Alan and as the report said, this isn't the only solution, but a big part of the solution is to get more men into traditionally female jobs and more women into traditionally male jobs. Mary, what are some examples where this has happened successfully? And I'm also going to mention here that we have we're very mindful of trans and non-binary participants in the report and in the workplace as well. Can I get you to explain, Mary, the ratio 40-40-20 and what that means as well, if you wouldn't mind?
Sure, absolutely. Thanks, Narelda. And first of all, I can see there's a question in the Q&A in relation to non-binary. So until last year, WGEA hadn't collected information on non-binary, and we had a voluntary question to enable non-binary gender to be designated for employees. It's fair to say the numbers are still quite low in terms of employers who are collecting and reporting that data to us, but another outcome of the review of the Act is a recommendation that we do collect a broader definition of gender, and we're excited for that to be legislated and implemented so that we can have that broader gender perspective in the future. At the moment, the data really we have is for men and women, and hence the analysis is presented in that context. In terms of examples for some of the shifting dynamics in terms of industries, and going to Carol's BHP example, I love some information that was provided in relation to BHP getting women driving their huge trucks in the mines, and they had a recruitment effort as part of this big agenda that BHP has had to fundamentally shift the balance of the workforce, and decided it was a good thing. The interesting outcome of women driving those big trucks in the mines has been on a couple of fronts. First of all, the safety record improved dramatically, because while the women were excellent drivers, they were actually much more safer drivers as well. And so there was a real worker well-being benefit as a result. But interestingly, there was an economic benefit as well, because those women were also driving those trucks more carefully. The wear on the tyres went down dramatically. And as you can imagine, they're big tyres and there was a substantial saving. So I just love that as an example of, women getting into non-traditional roles and actually really doing a great job at it and fundamentally shifting both the social and the economic outcomes as a result. Another example, and once again, it's women into male traditional roles, is an example of Kimberly-Clark. They had a factory. They were having a very difficult time recruiting women into the factory, and they had a look at their job descriptions, and they decided to remove the requirement for a forklift driver's license, because they thought, well, it's not a requirement, we can actually teach that on the job. And they found the year after in the next recruiting cycle, after removing that single requirement, 40% of their applicants were women, and it was 50% the subsequent year. So just by being intentional and thoughtful about some of the messages that are sent as a result of language that might suggest an outcome or a gender outcome, can actually make a very fundamental difference in terms of the recruitment process, and then how people then succeed and are effective through organisations. So there's just a couple of little examples of companies being thoughtful about how to shift the dial and change that dynamic. Now, there's a lot more that we need to do, obviously, and there's not a lot. There's some easy solutions and some that are harder. Obviously, a big one in lower paid industries is to get more men in, particularly, is increasing those wages as a really fundamental element to that. But we need to take some of those easy wins and then also be thoughtful about what we can change in the medium to longer term to shift those dynamics as well.
Mary, thank you very much for that. Alan, over to you now. There's a lot being said about increasing the value of traditionally, I hate talking about traditionally female and traditionally male roles, but that's the way that we are differentiating them. So in care roles that are traditionally female, how do we just increase the value of those roles? Carol said people have got to be paid more. I can't help but think that somebody's making profits of people being paid not very much in these. Is the answer just can we just, like, with a click of a switch, to start paying carers more?
Look, it's a really important question, and one that's been raised a lot in some of the discussions, the reaction and the feedback to this report. It's, for me, certainly the case that the way that we measure productivity is naive. I believe it's also gendered in its nature. And a lot of the debate around real wage growth, you've seen it tied to productivity. Well, we can't deliver real wage growth beyond productivity. But then, in the same breath, we have this communication around what productivity actually means, and it's a very unnuanced, a very myopic measure. If you actually go to the Productivity Commission's own interim report on productivity, it's almost taken as a given that the way that we measure productivity is to count up the value of the stuff that people make, divide by the number of workers that make it, and call that a measure of productivity. And actually the Ready Reckoner example in the back of the report talks about somebody making chocolate bars, which make a profit of $2 to make 50 an hour, and so your productivity is $100 for a chocolate bar that takes you 30 seconds to consume. And yet there is no equivalent equation that speaks to the value of a childcare worker who is not just caring for children, allowing parents to be productive in the labour market, but is also developing, the child's, potential and creating value through their contribution over the medium and the longer term. But there's no connection that then links that back to the remuneration that that is afforded to childcare workers. So I mean, it's an absolutely valid point that that we have seen sort of relatively childcare in particular a sort of stagnation of the remuneration. But I think we need to be a little bit more intelligent in the way that we consider the value, not of, for example, childcare, but of course many other care sector roles which are in in the same vein. And then how you can complete the circle. It's very easy for an organisation to measure their profits or their exports and then connect that to the wages that they offer their workers. But it's not so easy to be able to measure those value contributions that that care sector workers make and then connect it to remuneration. But perhaps one thing to look at is the award wage system in Australia. Because if you look at the award wage system, which is often setting levels of remuneration for workforce in service sector industries, you tend to find that the relativities within the award wage system and the determinations that you see are pretty inertic. Pretty much all of the award wages are increased by about the same proportion, regardless of the sector in which the award wage holder works. Perhaps that's somewhere we can start, alongside a far more authentic measure of value that takes on the medium and the longer term value contribution as well as the immediate one.
Thank you very much, Alan. Yeah, I think yes, Carol, you've got something to add to that?
Yes, could I comment on two parts of that? One is the education sector and the other is the early childhood education sector. And what we're seeing in the education sector is there's a much more active debate about the role of teachers in school and the critical role they play in determining the workplace capabilities of future employees. And what we're seeing is that Australian students are slipping down the international ranks in terms of mathematics and in literacy. So our education standards are falling backwards. That means the productivity capabilities of this economy is slipping backwards relative to other developed economies. So it is an economic debate, and people are saying, how do we get better educated students that are better equipped for the tasks of the future workforce? And it means thinking about the whole career profession of teachers. We've loaded teachers with a huge amount of administrative work. We've asked them to teach and to take responsibility for a much wider range of things than was previously the case. And so what you're finding is people coming in and saying, we need to have a profession where we have got really high quality teachers that are producing really high quality outcomes. And we do it by professionalizing teachers, having much higher grading of teachers so that you can become a sort of an advanced teacher and not necessarily a principal, but move up the scale by the quality of your teaching expertise, that you have administrative assistants that take some of the tasks that teachers are currently doing and reduces that workload. So there is an active debate about how do we make teaching better able to produce more effective workers. And in the early childcare sector, we're moving away from saying these are just nurseries where parents can dump their kids and go to work, to saying those early years are critical to develop the brains of our young people, and particularly people from disadvantaged backgrounds, so that they will be highly productive members of society and highly productive employers. So there is an economic and social debate taking place now, and the corollary of that should be we need to have career progression for these people and we need to pay them well.
Yes, Carol, excellent point there. Liz, I'm going to go to you now, because for some people in regional Australia, it's a luxury to even have a childcare centre, is it? To be able to take your children, and that only exacerbates the pay gap?
Absolutely, Narella. We've seen that the Mitchell Institute put out some excellent research identifying what is devastatingly known as a childcare desert, and this is having, you know, massive ramifications in terms of particularly female participation in the workforce. We know that they're underrepresented when it comes to participation in the workforce. So anything that we can do, and I know to Alan's point, the award wage, I know that childcare was certainly a hot topic as part of the National Jobs and Skills debate. This is a really serious issue, and we definitely need to look at valuing that service more than we do. As Alan's mentioned, the economic benefits, the social benefits to children, and simply women just cannot participate without that support. Although, just to put a regional lens on that, when we think about, I guess, you know, regional Australia, a lot of our work is, we've done some numbers on, you know, projections of higher levels of population moving to regional Australia, and there are economic and social benefits to that population moving to the regions, and one of them is that people are reconnecting with their family, their extended family, which actually can help to relieve some, not all, but some of the burden, the childcare burden that has been felt out in regional Australia. So if you can join the dots and look at this in a holistic way, from how does corporate Australia and all of the sectors that we're thinking about become more flexible, value agility, value talent over postcode location, as we love to say, you know, live where you love, not live where you work, you can start to create a range of solutions and you know, drawing on traditional methodologies of it taking, you know, a village to raise a child, that would really open up some opportunities for women to re-engage in the workplace in ways that perhaps they couldn't previously.
Liz, fantastic point. So you create the workplaces to give people the places to work while you're allowing people to work in other workplaces at the same time. Childcare, it's incredible. Mary, I'm going to come to you. I've got a couple of questions to you just on that postcode point that Liz just raised just then, and I'll go back to the report and we can start comparing postcodes, which is really interesting. But we've got a question from the audience, and this is by Anonymous, and I'm just going to tell everybody you're most welcome not to put your name to questions. Submit the questions anonymously if you wish. But this is a great question about the reporting of pay and allowing organisations to declare how much they're paying their employees. What do you think about that, Mary?
So yes, and this happens on two levels. There's the pay secrecy issue, which has actually been in the paper in the last 24 hours and flagged some legislation that the government is expected to introduce next week. There is not a broad depth of research in relation to pay secrecy, but you know, fundamentally, if there's more transparency and more awareness of pay rates, that equips women and men in terms of their negotiations and discussions, and allows that to happen on a more equitable basis. So, you know, we believe pay secrecy is, you know, an important issue to move on and to add some light to it. There's also the broader issue of gender pay gap transparency, which relates to the reporting of gender pay gaps at an organisational level. That's something that WGEA has not been able to do previously. Our legislation specifically prohibits it, but there's a commitment from the government to introduce gender pay gap transparency at an organisational level. And once again, that's a legislative change that is being worked on currently. That will make a big difference as well, because what it will highlight, you know, as we've been able to highlight in this report, gender pay gaps by regions and by postcodes, standards, it will enable us to report gender pay gaps at an employer level. And the experience in the UK is that has driven a reduction in the gender pay gap. It's driven an increase in engagement by employers, an increase in action, and even a consumer response, which has been interesting as well in terms of people voting with their feet in terms of companies they purchase from or make decisions with. We believe it could even drive a labour market response in terms of people making decisions, or at least being informed about gender pay gaps at companies in the tight labour market that we've been talking about. So transparency always adds value and helps from our perspective in terms of driving gender equality.
So Mary, are you saying that they would create like consultancy jobs and auditing jobs?
So yes, it might create some of them, and as we know, some of those professional and scientific technical areas could do with more women and at those high salary rates and to help drive gender pay gap down. But most of all, we're trying to drive action at an employer level so that that they can, you know, really equally value men and women, and WGEA is well equipped and well placed to work with employers to achieve that outcome.
All right, thank you. Ellen, I'm going to bring you in here now to talk about some of those stats. The comparison, like WA 32% gender pay gap compared to Tasmania 10.4. What's going on there, and what's Tasmania doing so well?
Look, it's a very, very stark difference, absolutely. But one level, and this is the point behind the report, it's not necessarily that Tasmania are intentionally doing something different. The composition of the workforces in Tasmania and Western Australia are very, very different. And of course, we do know that Western Australia, there's a really sort of high share of the workforce from resource sector. Of the data reported to WGEA, around 14% of employees are in resources. That's by far the largest share across the country, and because of the pay level in resources, that is what drives the overarching pay gap in WA, alongside some of the other concentrations. For example, the professional, scientific and technical sector, sort of heavily technical and sort of STEM dominated. We find also that some of the pay gaps in that sector are relatively high. So a combination of factors, but more to do with the sort of compositional differences and the particular features of Western Australia. And that's why the result of our thought experiment in pushing towards a sort of 40-40-20 model, and that is to say, shifting the resource sector in Western Australia to not full parity, but 60% of men and 40% of women from its current position, which is around 80% of men. Even just doing that alongside 40-40 balances in other sectors would halve WA's gender pay gap. So I think one of the important parts of this report is it really does indicate the extent to which segregation across sectors has a significant role to play in gender pay gaps, especially in states such as Western Australia.
Thank you, Alan. Carol, I'm going to come to you now. There's a couple of questions about the role of government here and in supporting businesses and encourage them to provide flexible work options and support family and care responsibilities. That's one question. The other comment that's been made is that the Victorian government has introduced targets and requirements that are compulsory for certain projects in 2024. There's the specific example that has been given. Is this an example of perhaps what the government needs to do, is to set targets or requirements for workplaces to achieve relating to new projects or bringing on new staff members, new workplaces or workforces?
There is an active debate across the nation and around the world on targets versus compulsory requirements. And when you look at the fact that 50 years on, we've made such slow progress, that gives support to people that are in favour of compulsory targets being set for organisations. They're saying no matter what the law says, there's an ability of organisations to pay men more than women. So we're going to have to force change. And that's in quotas for women on boards, quotas for women on organisations that are tending for government work. So it's an active debate. And what you want to be able to say is that you've tried all other avenues to achieve a reasonable outcome, but there seems to be blockages, and you can't get over those blockages by encouragement and by generally setting targets. So some countries have said if the targets don't work, we're going to make it compulsory, and the evidence of that is that once you break that the behavioural patterns and you create roles for women, perhaps on boards or in senior leadership team. And guess what? The sky didn't fall in. Guess what? They were really quite competent at what they were doing, and they've created role models. The need for making it compulsory goes away. So there's an active debate, and it should not by any means be the first resort. But if you are finding blockages at every turn, and if there's evidence globally that by putting compulsory targets in, you can unblock those blockages, and then it becomes self-reinforcing, then that provides much stronger arguments for making it compulsory.
Mary, you've got a point?
Yes, just to add to that, and certainly there's that argument that Carol's talking about in terms of government's role to drive change within business. But I would argue very clearly that clear targets within businesses about achieving their gender equality outcomes are absolutely fundamental. And some of Alan's earlier work showed that relationship between setting clear targets and for things like women at senior levels and the achievement of reducing the gender pay gap did make a difference. It actually drove the change. And what we certainly argue is that gender equality should be a core part of the corporate business plan. It's part of the strategy, and all aspects of the strategy have KPIs, and there should be KPIs around gender equality as well. So it's not that they become some unusual thing that's stuck on the side, or a nice to have. It's actually good business practice, corporate strategy. Gender equality is a fundamental part of it. You have KPIs on all of those aspects, of which the board holds the CEO holds the executive and the managers and so on, accountable to them as part of their performance, is what will drive the change within organisations, and they should be there, they should be embedded, and they should be a requirement.
Carol, you had something else that you would like to add?
Absolutely. So when I said you've got to have tried all of the available mechanisms to achieve it, it's not just about saying we want more women in our line roles, we want more women in senior management and on boards. There has to be a strategy that says, why aren't we getting them in the first place? And how you define the recruitment process, taking out the fact that you need to be a forklift driver is an important part. So look at what are the requirements you set for the role. When people get into the roles, what are the gaps they've got, and how do you supplement that with training? What is the career progression that you are offering that person in the organisation? And that may involve use of mentoring, it may be involved supplementing some training for them, but working with them as talent and saying, how do we progress them through the organisation? If you just recruit people and say, well, if they don't survive, that's their fault, then you're not owning the task of making inclusive roles for women. And I think a lot of organisations think that once they've recruited a woman, they've done all that they need to do, but there certainly needs to be an active support of that woman through their career, and particularly if they are moving from a support role to a line role, active mentoring to ensure that they fail. All too often, I've heard senior executives say, I put a woman in that role. She used to be head of HR. She's very smart, but I put her in a line role and she failed dismally. And so I'm never going to do it again. And when you say to them, well, who was the manager that coached her? Who was the manager that identified gaps in her skills and sought to supplement them either before she took the role or as she was doing the role? Oh, we didn't do that. It was up to her to do that. Well, no, it's not. So some of them set women up to fail, and that is their job. That's their responsibility. It's not the woman's responsibility. If you are going to achieve these desirable outcomes, you have to have a path to success and not just stop at step one.
Carol, we are all hearing you there. I think we've unfortunately probably witnessed that, and that can probably go for any identified position that is out there. And Alan, before we move on from the issue of setting targets, I know that BCEC and WGEA have previously looked at discretionary payments, but if there were bonuses paid to improve the gender concentration, would that help?
Look, I think the idea of targets rather than quotas, as Carol was mentioning, I think it does create opportunities for the sort of demonstration effect that outcomes are actually going to improve. I think one of the most important reports in this series in 2020 was around the causal link between diversity and business outcomes. Beth Castles and myself in the 2020 report established that as a link, and so created the fact that created an opportunity for businesses to draw benefit from the diversity that can create. I mean, it's definitely the case that the discretionary pay gap is a thing. It's there's a male bonus premium that we talked about in possibly the third report in our series, and you can see it. And that's why when we talk to the fact that when you look at total remuneration rather than base salary, there is always a larger gender pay gap. I think it gives businesses pause to reflect on whether or not their remuneration practices, the discretionary practices, are biased by gender. But of course, if the opportunity for overtime or discretionary bonuses are based on an work environment which is discouraging or less accessible to women, then that's why we see what we see. Whether or not direct incentive payments is the answer, I don't know, but I mean, for me, I think just with the evidence that demonstrates that that these sorts of divisions between in the workforce by gender occur, I think the onus is on businesses just to consider more fairly how they distribute their work opportunities.
Thank you for that. Liz, I'm going to come to you now. We've got a lot of questions coming in about changing culture. Cultural change, as we all know, is kind of a longer term thing that is a challenge for some. But in your experience, are people ready to embrace the fact that they might need to move with the times? Has there been resistance to that?
Yeah, look, it's a really challenging area, and I guess part of my previous research with Alan actually looked at the impacts of social construction, and we know that children's identity forming and norming really happens up until the age of 7 or 8 years of age. And so those very early patterns that they are learning and identifying from what is women's work, what is considered men's work, this is happening at such a young age that this I guess structure is being imprinted on their world. And there's been some great examples given about the case studies of women stepping into men's sectors, traditionally men's sectors, but we don't hear enough about men stepping into traditional women's sectors. And I can tell you a personal experience. One of my, I think, most effective childcare educators at my daughter's childcare centre is in fact a young gentleman called Angus. And I see him with the children. He engages with them in a very different way, and brings, I think, a different sense of energy to the role, and a playfulness, with the kids. And childcare is particularly damning in terms of that segregation. So, I don't necessarily have all the answers here, but we do have to think about, as parents, how are we modelling our lives for our children? What do they understand about work from a very young age? My daughter understands that I come to work. I've had some really interesting conversations with her about the fact that I am the boss. It took her some time to understand that, because of just simply because of cartoons that she'd been watching where they were predominantly men in those leadership roles. And she is 5 years of age. So, and she understands that now and is asking some really interesting questions. So when we talk about social norms, when we talk about cultural reform, we need to look at ourselves first, and we need to try to have a national conversation about, what are we actually modelling on a day-to-day basis for our children.
Yeah, great point. Alan, you had something to add to that.
Yeah, it's interesting. Some of the reactions to the report's findings, I think, were fascinating from that the broader sort of cultural perspective. So, when talking about, creating more opportunities for men to work in historically female-dominated sectors, very much the reaction was, well, that means you'd be, forcing men to work in lower salary sectors. But there's a sort of silence with the status quo, if that's, that's the reaction then. But tacitly, are you then saying it's okay for women to work in lower salary sectors? It's only when the very idea that a man might, might see salary fall, that it becomes an issue. And I think that probably draws on some of the embedded norms around, well, women's work is lower paid. Men do all of the, the heavy lifting and draw the great salaries as a result. So the whole sort of the culture and the social norms, I think, is a really important part of the story.
Alan, what I thought was really fascinating from the findings was when you talked about age, and you saw the age trajectory going like neck and neck, and then there's a steady onward trajectory, and then a drop off for older women, which we've got a question here about that. And you also mentioned that there are improvements based on what is being focused on. So do you see, if we're focusing on, say, that women in the age bracket of 45 to 50s, keeping in lockstep, in 10 years' time, do you think we're going to see the fruits of that labour?
Yeah, no, it's a conjecture, but I think it's worthy of further exploration, because we talk, for example, about the experience of Western Australia and the contribution that the mining sector makes to the overall gender pay gap in Western Australia, and that is because of the high concentration of men in the sector across all ages. But when you look at the so-called, like-for-like pay gap in mining, the pay gap is actually relatively small compared with other sectors. However, it may very well be the case that that's also a cohort effect working through in mining and in other sectors such as manufacturing, whereby the younger cohorts are being employed and recruited and progressed on a more even basis. But older cohorts of workers perhaps have not been able to benefit to the same degree from that greater focus on equality of opportunity. I certainly think it sort of throws up some questions around whether or not, from businesses' own perspectives, in a review of whether or not there's equity, across the workforce, including more experienced workers. I think certainly from the results that we found in this research, I think it does open up a set of questions. And then more generally, the sort of culture of recruiting and retaining and promoting people across all age brackets for me, especially in the current climate with the sort of the tightness of the labour market and skill shortages that we've all been hearing about, I think there's a huge premium to reflect on whether or not we are genuinely accessing talents across the age spectrum, or whether or not we have some unconscious biases about recruiting and retaining or promoting people in older ages, and whether or not those biases might be to the disadvantage of women in those age brackets. So I think it opens up some really fascinating but important conversations on age discrimination as one of the factors here.
Yeah, everyone's agreeing with that. Mary or Carol, would you like to add? Was that particularly concerning that you saw that that drop off of women in the pay gap? Perhaps Carol. Sorry, Mary. I'll go to you, Mary.
Oh yeah, I was going to say absolutely, and it ties in with some analysis we did on this data, which we released recently, called Ages and Wages. And one of the interesting things to add to what Alan said is that we found at no stage were more than 50% of women seeking to work full time, but 90% of the managerial roles were full-time roles. And so you've got this distinction between how women see they can work in terms of the choices and the juggle that they have, and the opportunities to have those higher paying roles at the senior levels that would go some way to reducing that divergence of the gender pay gap. And so we think it's really important as well that we challenge employers to reimagine what management roles look like. Can they be done part-time or flexibly, rather than seeing it as a very traditional full-time male type role. So there's opportunities for that sort of thinking, which can fundamentally open up access to those senior executive opportunities for more women.
Well, it's like what does a boss look like, right? It's that idea that we've all grown up thinking, what does that look like? And people bring their values into the workplace, and it's the fact that managers are often people who've come up the ranks. And they're not being born and bred to be a manager. They're just a person that knows that industry or that workplace. But who's to say that they're the best manager? It could be somebody else that's overlooked because they're not stereotypically someone that we look at to think that you could be my boss, which is just that's kind of goes to the change. We've only got 5 minutes. Can you believe it? I think we're so engrossed in this conversation. I'm going to ask each of our panelists now to address our very final question before we wrap up for the afternoon. There's this one lovely question that's been provided here. If you were to all give just one action tomorrow that we could all do to improve gender equality in Australian workplaces, what would you do? Alan, I'm going to start with you, and we will. Didn't
have a chance to write anything down, Narelda. No, look, as you can see from the report, I think there are so many points of entry to try and drive improvements in gender equality in Australia. I do think, and I think this is something that's come through a lot in the conversation. Recognising the value of work in sectors that have been historically dominated by women, and just promoting a genuine remuneration for the contributions that are made to all of our lives, for me is a key priority. I think it's a missing piece of the puzzle, but I think it's a really important piece to find pretty quickly.
Thanks, Alan. Carol.
Yes, I think there's a crisis in our education system. If we're going to be a high-income country and an inclusive country going forward, we need an education system that produces people that have productive, meaningful work for the whole of their careers. And I think there's starting to be a realisation that we really need to change the structure of the education profession. And I think if we can do that well, we will get career progression for women. We will see males and female students and seeing women women in senior roles and seeing them make a contribution to the economic development of the nation. So let's get education right. Let's get back up to the top of the global ranking for education scores for our students and become a more productive and socially more cohesive society.
Thank you, Carol. Liz.
Look, I think I would say that I would ask employers to really consider recruitment through the lens of talent and not through the lens of location. If we can become a location agnostic country, then we really open up what I would call a truly national employment market, and that will go a long way to closing the gap that is, quite frankly, entrenched in this country. So it is a really simple move that we can make. We've certainly made some ground throughout COVID, but we've got a lot more work to do. And it starts at the top with the leaders, the CEOs and the boards who are starting to put those targets in place. In fact, maybe we need to make that a target, is understanding that we want talent from right across the country, and it shouldn't matter where they're located, because we shouldn't have this rural and regional penalty that we're currently facing, seeing the kind of percentage gaps that we're seeing across the country.
Thank you, Liz. And our final say today from the Director of WGEA, Mary Wooldridge.
Thanks, Nerelda. And everyone's been very strategic and high level, and I'm going to take the question at its face value, which is what could someone do tomorrow, and be very practical. Do a gender pay gap analysis in your workplace and understand what's driving the differences in your workplace so that you have the information. I mean, what today's report shows is when you have information, you have knowledge, and that enables action and plans and strategies to be put in place to drive change. And so, you know, I'll do a plug. There's a tool on the WGEA website. You can go and do a gender pay gap analysis and really understand what's driving it, where those differences are, and how to make change in the workplace.
Oh, thank you so much for all of your contributions to this discussion. Wherever you are around Australia, please put your hands together for Mary Wooldridge, Carol Austin, Liz Ritchie and Alan Duncan. Alan, thank you so much for the research that you conducted through BCEC with partnership with WGEA. It's going to be studied and written about for years to come and acted upon, and I'm going to draw some inspiration from NASA. Just bear with me. Do you remember when they sent the missiles up to shift the trajectory of the meteor to save the planet? Well, I feel like the actions that we can put in place is going to change the trajectory for women and gender diverse Australians in this country. And it starts with us at home, it starts in our communities, it starts with the society that we build and that we create. So thank you once again for your contributions, and thank you to our hundreds of people who are around the country that are listening in, either in your workplace or in your home or in your office. We appreciate you, and we look forward to what you can do, as Mary said, in your workplaces. That starts tomorrow, that starts today. You can find out more about the work of the BCEC and the report that has been written. You can download it at bcec@curtin.edu.au. So just go to that website and you can find it there. Thanks once again for attending, and let's put our hands together and ask the universe and do what we can for a more equal and equitable Australia. Thank you very much for your attention. Buddha, goodbye.